Assa Marra.
Assa Marra, proudly brought to you with the support of Axiom Joint Venture. Welcome to the Assa Marra podcast, my love letter to the beautiful people and places of West Cumbria. This episode with Colin Cox, Director of Public Health for Cumberland, feels like a landmark moment for the Assa Marra podcast. I was contacted by Luke Stamper from Colin's comms team because Assa Marra is increasingly becoming a place where conversations that matter to West Cumbria are taking place. It's becoming somewhere local people tune in to hear stories, ideas and discussions that reflect the innate character, challenges and strengths of this remarkable part of the world. And today's conversation is one of the most important we've had. West Cumbria is a place of extraordinary contrast. Many of us wake up each morning to breathtaking views of the Irish Sea or the Fells. It is one of the most beautiful landscapes anywhere in the country. Yet behind some of those front doors are lives affected by poverty, addiction, poor health and isolation. Hanging over too many families is another painful reality. Suicide rates, particularly among men, remain significantly higher than the national average. It's not something any of us want to define West Cumbria, but neither can we ignore it. The question is why? That is the question Colin Cox invites us to explore. As I sat opposite Colin, what struck me wasn't simply the depth of his research. It was his sincerity, his public spirit, and his genuine desire to improve the lives of the people he serves. Before COVID, I suspect many of us never really thought about anybody in public health. Then almost overnight, public health professionals became some of the most important voices in the country. Night after night, we turned on our televisions, looking for reassurance and guidance from people like Professor Chris Whitty, Jonathan Van Tam and Patrick Vallance. Here in Cumbria, many came to know Colin through his television appearances, interviews and public briefings. While those national figures were helping to guide the country, Colin was helping to guide our own communities through one of the most uncertain periods in recent history. Calm, measured and evidence-led, he became a trusted voice for many local people. His latest public health annual report carries the provocative title, Man Up. That question mark matters. This isn't a call for men to become tougher. It's an invitation to ask whether some of our traditional ideas about masculinity are still serving men well. For generations, many men in West Cumbria worked in industries where resilience, stoicism, and simply getting on with the job weren't just admired, they were essential. Mining was dangerous. Heavy industry was unforgiving. Tomorrow was never guaranteed. Those values built strong families and even stronger communities. But they may have also left a legacy where too many men still feel they have to carry life's burdens alone. West Cumbria is a place where so much seems amplified. We have some of the most spectacular scenery in Britain. Sellafield has brought world-leading expertise and some of the highest average salaries in the country. Yet alongside that prosperity, our communities facing deep deprivation and significant health inequalities. Those realities exist side by side. So perhaps the question isn't whether men should man up. Perhaps the better question is, how do we help men open up? How do we create communities where strength includes vulnerability, where asking for help is seen as courage rather than weakness, and where every man knows where he belongs? This is a thoughtful conversation. At times it's challenging. It raises difficult questions without pretending there are easy answers. But if Assa Marra is my love letter to West Cumbria, then it has to celebrate not only the beauty of this place, but also the courage to have the honest conversations about the challenges we face. I hope you find my conversation with Colin Cox as thoughtful and inspiring as I did. Hello, this is Catherine Williamson. This is the Assa Marra podcast. This is the love letter to West Cumbria, the magnificent people and country that makes up this beautiful part. So I have a guest today and I'm quite excited about my guest. Please, Colin Cox, say hello.
Hello, Catherine, and hello to everybody on the podcast.
Well, Colin, the reason I'm quite perky is the back history to Assa Marra was my attempt to, when I met my husband, West Cumbrian, it became very clear that we would be heading back to West Cumbria. He's coming home. He's retiring after 48 years as a teacher.
That's some record.
That is some record. I have been yesterday in Whitehaven Academy and today in Westlake School on 2 very hot days, and I have nothing but marvel for teachers because they've been quite exacting conditions today. We've been teaching young people podcasting skills to help build confidence. Anyway, one of the things about coming to West Cumbria is recognising that it is beautiful. The people are incredible, but it's quite quirky, isn't it? There's something about that extra hour and 10 minutes from the M6 that brings around you could almost say a different worldview, because you're not from here, are you?
No, I'm not. The accent might give that away. No, I'm here from Scotland, but there are very similar things in some places to some parts of the west of Scotland as well. But no, it's a different, it's a unique culture.
You've held some big jobs, haven't you?
Yes, that certainly. I did more media in the first week of COVID than I had done in my entire career up till that point, I think. So certainly it threw me in at the deep end of some of that. I think we probably will talk a bit more about COVID when we get onto the questions, because that was a very significant experience for me.
I thought as much. So you are Director of Public Health at Cumberland Council?
I am Director of Public Health and Customer and Community Wellbeing at Cumberland Council, so I've got a broader portfolio.
Yes, and I suppose having that bigger remit means that your sphere of influence to some of the areas that need to join up a bit and bring policy. You've been in post since 2014, is that correct?
Yes, in Cumbria since 2014 as Director of Public Health, and since coming into Cumberland when it was formed, taking on that broader role as well.
Now, some job titles take a little bit of piecing together. Yours seems to be one that you would sort of work out what it is you do every day. But do tell us.
Public health, where people will be familiar with public health, obviously, because of the pandemic. But that's mostly not what public health does. Mostly what it looks at is the things that impact on people's health and well-being, and what we can do to help people live healthier lives. And that can be behavioural issues, of course. People might be familiar with that. But people's health and well-being is influenced by much more than that. It's influenced by their environment, by society, by the economy that's on around about them. So it's about trying to make sure that we are operating as a society in a way that's as healthy as possible. But my job title is also customer and community wellbeing. So I've got all our customer services. So people who are contacting the council for whatever reason come into contact with some of my team first. And that gives us an opportunity to put health and well-being right at the heart of everything we're doing, and try to access health and well-being support at whatever level you're coming into the council.
So tell me a little bit about when you've come to West Cumbria specifically, and you've what are the bits that strike you, or some of the challenges?
It's a challenge and it's a privilege. I remember when I first arrived in Cumbria, where I came here from Manchester, where I'd been the Deputy Director of Public Health, and driving around places in Cumbria, and particularly in the West Coast, you're driving around thinking, somebody's paying me to do this. It's a real pleasure. But of course, West Cumbria is not without its share of challenges. And in particular, you think of Cumbria, if you don't live here, if you don't know Cumbria, you think of it as the Lake District. And it's the kind of rural areas, it's the farming, and that's the thing that's for front and foremost in so many people's mind. But West Cumbria in particular is a different place altogether. It's got that history of industrial decline. It was an industrial, heavy industry place in many parts of West Cumbria, and so suffered the same sort of industrial decline as so many other parts of the country did over the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And the challenge for West Cumbria has been finding what replaces it. In places like Manchester and Glasgow, the heavy industry has been replaced by arts, entertainment, finance, tech, that sort of thing. And you mentioned the extra hour and a bit from the M6. Maybe that's one of the challenges here. It's been harder to find what replaces the heavy industry that used to be in its place. And that has a massive cultural impact. as well as a purely economic one.
And we've got this sort of mono-employer situation with Sellafield, haven't we? I've always found this duality between, I think it's the second highest wages in the country because of the distortion factor of Sellafield. Yet so many of the challenges you're facing are coming from economic, well, I say poverty, but there's this duality between the wages that are being paid 3 miles around the bend from where we're sat today, and actually a lot of people that are really fighting to economically are really struggling. I remember when my husband brought me up and he was bringing his girl home to show his family. He very wisely started the tour at Hembeck, near Bothbrow Rugby Club, which is beautiful. And then we set up along Cleatormore High Street, and the contrast between that beautiful scenery below Dent and, I think there was 4 or 5 pubs in Cleatormore, they're down to Moffat's now. It felt very, very, very different. And as we drove out again, I thought you've got this contrast between this incredible setting. So people wake up every day to an extraordinary view. But, the pubs have gone, but you've got the pie shop, there is that, how do they keep that community bit going? And so they've got this backdrop of beauty and yet some real challenges, because I know Cleatormore, I guess Lisa Birdsall, she was originally from Cleatormore, and she talks about 26 either family, friends or people connected to her taken or attempted their life through suicide. And Cleatormore's got a massive problem, hasn't it? And the distortion of the statistics around men and those men attempting to take their life around here, you know the stats, it's significantly different from the rest of the UK, isn't it?
It is. Cumbria as a whole has always had a high suicide rate. But in recent years, it has gone through the roof. It's really startling. If you look at the whole of Cumbria, if we had the same sort of suicide rate as the rest of the country as a whole, you'd expect there to be about 50 a year. Now, Cumbria always traditionally, I suppose, had about 60, so a few more than that. Now we're talking 85. So it has absolutely taken off. We've got one of the highest rates of suicide in the whole country now. And it's deeply distressing. And every one of those suicides is itself a tragedy and has a massive knock-on impact on people round about the person concerned. So it's a major problem for us.
You've got a big number. Have you started to even unpack what the contributing factors to that number are?
Well, we're trying. It's difficult to know what's causing that, but we have been doing a bit of research into some of this and what might be causing this significant difference in the numbers. And there's no simple answer. It's a complex mix of things, because you would expect more deprived areas to have higher rates. That's true here, but they're still higher than equivalent places. There's a whole pile of things that we're starting to see about support services, about people's ability to talk about these things, about whether people are accessing services that are available, whether the right sort of services are available to support people who are struggling. But there's also some hints that there are, again, cultural things, that sort of traditional men don't talk about these things, attitudes that might be influencing this in one way or another. So I think it is really important that we start to talk about these things very openly and help people to understand that it is okay to talk about their feelings, about their experiences, that it's that phrase that gets used, it's okay not to be okay. And we've got to help people through that.
I know a few times some of Don's friends have come down, and what I noticed, and it did take me aback, because I had visions of we'd have breakfast together and then we'd go off and maybe a bit of a dinner party, and that sounds a bit, but anyway, by 10:30 those blokes were in the pub. They walked to the pub, they were in the pub, and they stayed in that pub all day. And I was really shocked by that. And John said, well, that is the way we did it, The blokes would go out, they worked hard in the week, go out, and they'd spend a lot of the time in the pub. And I found that quite a shock, because it didn't feel quite the same cultural fit. I put my foot down for day 2, because I thought, well, I'll never get to see them. And that's a big thing to break through, because that would be still even in that situation of having a pint together, you'd still be sitting and talking, you'd be spending time together, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
The alcohol aspect is another case in point. But how are men finding their place to be a man these days?
Well, I think that's one of the big challenges that we've got. I've recently done a report on this issue. One of my jobs as the Director of Public Health, I have to do an annual report every year into the health of the population, and it gets themed every year. And this year, my focus has been on men. And partly that's about men's health and their well-being overall, but partly it was inspired by some real concerns that we've got about men's behaviour and attitudes as well. So there are two sides of this coin, aren't there? Men are struggling. I think there's no doubt about that. When you see the suicide rates, we've also got very high rates of drug and alcohol related deaths in Cumbria and in West Cumbria in particular. There are real challenges with access to employment. As you say, in West Cumbria, there's this very significant employer in Sellafield, which is brilliant for those who can get into those jobs. But for those who are struggling to get into those jobs, a lot of the jobs that are being advertised at the moment are at the risk of stereotyping things that would be considered more traditionally to be female-oriented jobs. There's lots of jobs in care and in aspects of hospitality. There's not so many jobs that you would think of as being traditionally male. And boys are falling behind in school compared to girls. So there's a lot of people who are really struggling.
Because I've been going into some of the schools, and what I've seen a counter position, which is the lads appear way more confident in participation in group exercises and speak out a lot more, and the girls seem a bit more oppressed. And I've got my work background. I'm a optimist, and I've got a big heart for helping and raising the lives of young women and girls. But women seem to have got our act together about, if I think of the number of people that come on my podcast, it's typically more women, because women are more prepared to talk about their feelings. They're directing it towards lived experience opportunities where they set up some community interest companies. But down in St. Bees, we've got this incredible chap called David Barnes, who's got this community dip. We've got a wild sauna down there. Now, I know other places in the country where they have that place booked out, completely booked out. You wouldn't be able to get a place. And it's been hard to get people to do some of the stuff that would be seen as, quite conventional activities. I'm not saying there is a very good turnout at community, but it's an amazing thing. And the men that are really trying to strive to tackle the problems in the community are doing an incredible job. But just like I remember when I did Rachel Holiday, and Rachel Holiday talked very clearly, she said, with homelessness, you won't see anybody begging on the streets around here. You won't see anybody lying in a doorway, and I never have. She said, but it doesn't mean to say the problem doesn't exist. It's hidden.
Yes.
So how do you go finding the problem to quantify it, to know how to solve it?
That's absolutely right. And when you started off that, talking about what you're seeing in schools, it's very positive to hear that boys are being articulate and putting themselves forward in that sense, because that gives a bit of hope for the future. But I think you're right that in the past 20 years, 30 years, we have definitely seen women getting their act together, as you put it, being that much more confident, being much more out there, much more independent in society, earning good salaries, not dependent on men in the same way that they traditionally were. And all of that is absolutely brilliant. It's exactly what we want to see happening. The challenge then comes if men see this as a zero-sum game and they see that women are gaining and they think that what that means is that they're losing. And it doesn't have to be that way. But there are forces out there that are trying to push that narrative. The forces of what might be called toxic masculinity and the manosphere are pushing this narrative that says that men are losing out and women are part of the problem there. And then that's creating a whole set of attitudes that are deeply problematic, creating misogyny, promoting domestic violence and domestic abuse of various forms, which are, again, in Cumbria is a huge problem. And the amount of the domestic abuse that we are aware of is huge, and we're not aware of most of it, would be my guess. So I do think that we've got some real challenges that we've got to address there. And help men to find a place in society that is not seen as opposed to women, or that men and women are fighting for the same part of society. We have to be together on this.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I've got female friends, I'm in my 60s, but I've got female friends that have just made a decision. It's easier to be on their own than just trying to find or embedding the skills or getting men in readiness to be equal to loving them. And I think that's a bit of a challenge as well, because the dating rituals, even things down to having opening a door, should you bait? There's some sort of dances now that once upon a time it was much more traditionally understood, wasn't it? And how the communication piece around how men feel that they're adding value in a relationship when women are becoming increasingly more self-reliant.
Yes.
And that's a really interesting thing, that instead of coming forward hand in hand, that we're growing at proportionate rates, that men and women are evolving to their particular sets of challenges. One is seemingly being left behind, or feels they're being left behind, and then is feeling some measure of anger around that.
That is a risk. That is a risk. And it doesn't have to be that way. And I do think we've always negotiated our way around gender relations, haven't we? It's always been something that people have had to pick their way through. But it's a bit different now. And there's a bit of a tendency in some quarter to say that men and women are the same. I'm not sure that I buy into that, but I don't think one is better. I think men and women bring each other up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what we need to be doing. And men need to be hugely supportive of the independence that women have developed, and help them to achieve that. And women have to help men to achieve the same, as we're now finding things, the pendulum swinging slightly. So I think we can do better than we're doing.
There's that lovely saying, isn't it? It takes a village to raise a child. But in a sense, it takes a community approach, doesn't it, to re-engage with men and bring some hope back in, because it's a pretty radical solution to your problems, isn't it?
Yes.
To take your life.
Yes, absolutely. And when you say it takes a community to raise a child, or a village to raise a child, child raising is one of those things that is traditionally seen as a woman's job. But as everybody would recognise, people need male role models as well, and particularly boys need male role models. But actually, so too do girls.
Yes.
And we have to be finding ways of generating good, positive male role models. The way in which some of the jobs have changed in the past 20 years has been really interesting. In primary schools now, there are many primary schools that do not have a single male teacher. And that shift has been profound. And so suddenly young boys are not seeing, other than within the family, potentially, and even there sometimes, not having positive male role models. And you're seeing boys being brought up with very little in the way of positive models of what it is to be a man. And that's bound to end up with problems.
As a kid, I was raised with a matching set of parents. I went to a school with a strong headmaster. I went to Sunday school, so I got a few values. I went into a comprehensive system. I still look at Kes and can't believe that only happened. I do remember us all getting slippered. I'm not saying that's the right thing, but it felt there was some very strong characters around. I watched telly, and Law Ingalls Wilder and Pa always sorted it down Plum Creek. The Waltons sorted a lot of their problems out down chopping wood with Pa, or tinkering on a tractor. And those people that were men that would be willing to do some mentoring or help, go and be under the lid of a bonnet of a car and talk to a lad that on the street that might have trouble. They're just getting too scared of doing it these days, aren't they?
Well, there is a risk of that, but we are trying to get some of that back, albeit in perhaps a more structured sort of way, because where that neighbourliness is not quite so strong as perhaps it used to be, there are things coming in its place. Men's sheds, for example. There are a few examples of those around about Cumberland, where men get to go together and just work together, as you say. And men are better at perhaps at talking when it's not sitting face to face across a table, but doing something together, talking side by side rather than face to face is quite often the way to do these things. And organisations like Andy's Man Club, which has been massively successful in trying to get men to talk to each other. And in terms of suicide prevention, I think things like Andy's Man Club are really important.
Yes, and wherever there's, in the place where you find darkness, you tend to find the light, don't you? The solution come forward, and people being proactive enough to stick their head above the parapet. You need a healthy degree of ego to do a job like yours, and by that I mean stick your head above the parapet, be a focus, take a leadership role. One of the things that is incredible about this area, and I've noticed as a community, I remember there was an unfortunate early death of a rugby league player at Wasp Brown Hornets, and they did a night. Everybody turned out. The money was incredible. What was raised, I think, something like £19,000.
Wow.
The community came together. They deeply grieved, but also communities can be quite self-regulating, can't they? I know that one of the things I hit here is you can't be too big for your boots. You can't stick your head too high. You can't boast about your achievements. There's a real bit of regulation. And I'm not burdened by that, so I big people up all the time because that isn't the culture I was raised in. But I do feel that sometimes that power of community can be so wonderful, and it's where the solutions can be found, aren't they?
Yes.
But also it can create certain dynamics that you have to break through as well.
Yes, and these things are always complicated to negotiate. There's never a simple answer in public health. There's never a simple answer in communities. And so much of it within communities relies on individuals as well. You can set up phenomenal community organisations and you think they're going really strongly, and then one or two key people leave and things can fall apart again. So things can be fragile.
So if you were to say, so bring it together, because I am quite excited about taking you through your questions. If you were to say, have we got a sense of the challenge? I feel hope in you. I know that you're very focused on it. I read the report, Man Up. And I love the fact that it's not the hospital's fault, or it's not falling on the services necessarily. Health and well-being should be at a community level, learning to flourish and having a flourishing mindset. You're very clear about the position you're taking up on. Are you seeing some of the old green shoots? And you've talked about the sheds and what would you suggest are the areas where you can see there's a breakthrough and where more needs to be done?
Well, I think there are some possible green shoots here. I have hope for the young, I have to say. I think for all that we hear quite a lot about things like the influence of Andrew Tate and the other sort of negative manosphere influencers, when we did some research for the report, in talking to professionals who work with young people about the extent to which they thought that was an issue, they weren't seeing that as being a major thing. And certainly when I talk to my kids, they say, yeah, they were aware of it, but most people thought it was nonsense. And they didn't buy into it, and they could see the manipulation that was happening. So I think a lot of our young people are pretty savvy to that sort of thing and can see through it. I think they do have the challenges around social media that will always be a major problem. I think, and I do worry about that. But I think there are opportunities there. I think they can see that, and the sort of more socially liberal perspective that they're bringing to the world at the moment is probably quite helpful. So I do have hope for that.
The next generation are meant to put right the problems that we created for them, and that we're doing what we can. I know that social media aspect is very much in the press at the moment, and we're being much more proactive about it. One of the things I've got to say about being in West Cumbria is we've got a phenomenal local MP in the form of Josh McAllister, and he's a very visible local MP, and he's out doing a lot of stuff. So it feels for me a very hopeful place. I've come in, I've been tremendously welcomed. The podcast has been really well received. I've found that people are very, very motivated to do stuff about it, but you're up against quite a lot of embedded stuff as the coal sits deeply in the seams and the mines. And I think one of the things I find interesting is people still seem to have that live for today mindset. And I think that must be to do with that in those days when those disasters took place or life was fragile. You felt that, you have this moment now. But we haven't got any working pits anymore, have we?
I mean, I think you're right that there are a lot of people in West Cumbria who see the challenge and are up for doing something about it.
Absolutely.
And that is really important, because the challenges that there are in West Cumbria are not going to get solved by people like me. I can sit here and talk about it, and I can try and fund a couple of services, but they'll never be enough.
Yeah, you're putting a lens on it, aren't you? You're bringing it all into one place and trying to get some understanding of what these shocking numbers, what sits behind these shocking numbers.
Yeah.
Where do you go best to make the singular biggest impact to start bringing about change?
Yes.
And as you say, unpacking that, it's like a ball of wool, isn't it? Where's the bit of string that can start, the bit of wool that you can start unraveling it or start to unknot it?
It is. And I think that the title of my report, you mentioned it was Man Up. You put it that way. It's a question. Man up. Because there is something about the phrase man up, which is quite traditional and suggests you've just got to be tough. And the point about the report is that it's asking, is that appropriate anymore? And I'm not sure it is. I think men can still find ways of fulfilling some of the traditional roles that they perhaps want to do. Men can be protectors, they can be providers, but they don't have to do it the way traditionally it was done. And that's the challenge that the report is trying to set out.
That's such a subtle difference. And you know what slightly changed my perspective on that? My husband coaches rugby at a very good school in Leamington. And he had these 6-year-olds and it was howling conditions. And he was trying to get them to think about how they could pass the ball more easily. He was expecting them to say, stand closer, get closer. And this lad put his hand very much in the air and went, so we've just got to man up. And I think in my response to reading that title, I was immediately going to the place that you're trying to question, aren't you? That's a really interesting, and it's a strong, subtle distinction. But that question mark.
The question mark is very important in that.
A question mark, because it leaves space for evaluation, speculation, curiosity. Is that the answer?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for using the Assa Marra podcast as a way of bringing some of these areas of concern and solutions to light. So as I move you into your questions, Colin, that moment, that gobsmack moment, we call it, that changed the trajectory of your life, what would that be for you?
Well, it has to be COVID. And that's not a single moment. But I suppose the point at which you recognise that things were going to change, I remember being in the chief executive's office in Cumbria House, watching the television as Boris Johnson said, from tomorrow you must stay at home. And you recognise that that's the point that so many things change. We'd seen it coming, but even so, hearing those words was extraordinary. But we'd been obviously seeing what had been happening in China. We'd seen the lockdown in Wuhan and the police on the street in the January. And I remember saying to my wife, it's extraordinary. I said, we would never do that here.
And we did.
And 2 months later, it wasn't quite like that. Of course, we didn't have police on the street or troops on the street enforcing to the same extent as they did in China.
We had a lot of fear on the streets.
But there was a lot of fear, and those lockdowns happened, and they were inevitable. They had to happen. At least to begin with, some of those things were, I think, really important. But it changed. It changed everything. It was the hardest I've ever worked, the longest hours I've ever worked. But in some ways, you kind of go, that's what I'm here for, and this is what I'm trained for. This is my job.
What training can possibly get you in readiness for that, though?
Well, there is formal training about how you deal with sort of communicable diseases. Now, nothing will quite ever prepare you in training for something of that sort of scale. But you deal with communicable disease, you deal with incidents, you deal with communicating with the public about these things. And then you just have to scale it up. But some of it is really hard. And in the very early days of the lockdown, it was almost like there wasn't anything we could do, because the lockdown had happened. That was it. And I remember the awful days early on in the lockdown. It's a horrible phrase, but it just felt like sitting at home counting the dead and mapping out how many people have died. Where is this likely to go? Because you're trying to plot on a curve How many cases have we got? When might this stop? What do we know? What don't we know? But the astonishing thing that came out of COVID was the way in which so many people pulled together. And we saw it in communities where everybody pulled together. The number of community groups that came together to look after people who were more vulnerable, make sure that people had access to food and medicines, that sort of thing. Absolutely extraordinary. And then within the council and the statutory organisations as a whole, the way in which people came together to support that response and to track cases and to build contact tracing systems, the effort was immense. And it was just, while it was obviously an absolutely awful time, in many ways it was also a massive privilege to be leading during that time and seeing the way everybody was able to pull together.
There's words, isn't it? We'll be generationally defined by PPE, bog rolls, pasta, and clapping on a Thursday night. But as we were passively sitting at homes waiting to ride it out, I watched the Makerfield. I like to do the election night. I like the atmo of waiting for the numbers to come in. But that's one night every so often. You would have been waiting for those numbers every single day, wouldn't you?
Yes.
That was like waiting to see whether those anticipated peaks. And it must have been such a dynamic time.
Oh, it was. And certainly after the kind of initial shock of the lockdown and what do we do, we realised very quickly that sooner or later we were going to have to start contact tracing and helping people identify when they needed to isolate, because that's the only way that you can come out of a full lockdown, is if you've got that sort of system in place. One of the things I'm most proud of that we've done in Cumbria was that we were the first local authority in the country to have a local contact tracing system up and running. It was up and running before the national contact tracing system. It was, at that point, it was crude, and there was no way we could get to everybody. But we decided we were going to do it. We just started, and we brought in people who knew what they were doing with it. The environmental health staff from the councils, sexual health staff who are good at contact tracing. And we just started off with spreadsheets, and we got information from the hospitals about what cases they had, and we just started doing it. And very quickly it grew, and we knew that we weren't going to be able to manage it like that. And we brought in people from the council's ICT system, and within 10 days of starting this, we'd actually managed to go live with an electronic contact tracing system that could be accessed from people's homes so that we weren't having to get people together to do the work. A full set of processes and procedures about how we were going to operate. Lots of people actually making the phone calls and doing the contact tracing. And we'd gone live with that in a 10-day period. And we had a group that was meeting and talking about the cases and identifying where there were outbreaks and taking action to tackle outbreaks. When people have the motivation and the time to pull together on something, you can achieve incredible things.
Compelling need.
Absolutely.
Compelling why.
I'm so proud of the team that did all of that.
Forgive me, it's my curiosity, but did the geographical aspect of West Cumbria, because there's lots of gaps, what was the proportionality in terms of the impact on West or Cumbria compared to the rest of the country?
By the end, it was very much the same across the whole country. But it's in the nature of pandemics that things flare up in different places at different times. So I well remember as we were coming out of lockdowns and starting to get into managing things as outbreaks, we had a high number of cases being identified in Barrow. And the Daily Mail ran the headline, "Is this Britain's first pariah town?" But the point about Barrow was, it was one of the first places to have a bit of an outbreak, but it certainly wasn't the only one. These things happen. But also a lot of what was happening in Barrow was that the hospital was doing a lot of testing. And EAE Systems was doing a lot of testing. So we were identifying.
Because you're on it, it got the bad rap.
Because they were on it. But it was extraordinary to see the way the media rounded on places like Barrow. They didn't make the same sort of comments when there were outbreaks elsewhere. It was a real challenge. But as I say, in many ways, a privilege to be part of that as well.
And I suppose that leads into that question I've asked about the gold in the dark, when what we mine in darker times is often rich and we find gold in dark places. So for you, what would you say they were?
Well, I think I've touched on some of it. You know, the way in which people pulled together was just brilliant, and the resilience that people showed was extraordinary. And I suppose if I look on it personally, the thing that I took away from it for myself was this was new to me. I'd never done anything like this before. Most people hadn't, but I managed it.
Yeah.
And I think led it effectively. And that is a source of pride, that people were willing to rally round and take that leadership.
And it made sort of public figures of people. I mean, a friend of mine was saying, "Oh, I've got a meeting next week with Professor Chris Whitty," and I went, people were just thrust forward, weren't they, and put front and centre, of which you were too.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting. Chris was up in Cumberland just last week.
I feel it's the event of my lifetime.
Yes.
I think we've normalised the fact that we were locked in our houses. The first time was, I think, was better experience than the second time, because there was a bit of a novelty aspect to it. The next time it felt like it was just ongoing, but we came the other side, didn't we?
Yes, we did. We were always going to get through it, but it was always going to be a challenge. And I also think it is really important to recognise the different experiences that people had. Because for me, I mean, I was working the whole time, but
that would have been a potential for you, but not being furloughed in the back garden, being paid.
But beyond that, lockdown meant staying at home. I've got a decent size of garden. I had a place in my house that I could work fine. Yeah. I wasn't in a single flat. You know, if I'd been in a one-bedroom flat in a city with no outdoor space, my experience of lockdown would have been very, very different. So I think it is important that we recognise the different experiences that people had of that.
Yes, like every situation where the pressure's applied, it's like pushing down water and seeing where it shoots. It spurts up. You don't quite know until you know. So if we go to your the question I asked you, whether it be a world event or a personal event where you absolutely knew where you were at that exact moment, what was it for you?
See, the problem here is that you probably get all the same answers here. It's either going to be 9/11 or it's going to be Princess Diana. Well, Princess Diana is very boring because I was in bed and just turned the radio on and was wondering why there was just music rather than the news. And so that's not a very interesting answer. But 9/11 will always stick, of course it will. And I was in the Philharmonic pub in Liverpool at the time. I was doing my Masters in Public Health. And it was the last day that we'd all been doing our vivas for our dissertations. So that had kind of all finished, and we were all in the pub afterwards having lunch and a pint. And I got a message from a friend of mine. My sister lives in the West Bank, and she was there at the time. And this message just said, "Please tell me Heather isn't still in the West Bank." I was going, Why? What's happened? Because I think the automatic assumption was that it was Palestinian terrorism that was involved. One of the guys that we were with, it was kind of very, very early days of smartphones. So I didn't have one, but one of them did have a way of accessing the news and saw some of the news that the planes had hit the towers. And most people did. Oh, wow, that's a bit dramatic. And then went back to their points. And I was sitting there going, no, this is more than a bit dramatic. This is the world has changed. I didn't actually have a television at the time, but I just knew that this was something that had to be seen, not heard on the radio. So I went to a friend's and we sat there the whole afternoon following the news and just seeing it time and time again, just going, oh, the world has just changed instantly.
I don't want anything that will top that in my lifetime. So when we come into the wisdom or maybe an insight from a film or a quote or a book, play or something where that has resonated with you and you'd like to offer it back to our listeners, what would that be?
Can I give you two?
I will definitely be greedy.
Because I always hate it when people say, what's your favourite?
Yeah.
And I know you haven't quite pitched it like that, because there's no such thing as a single favourite, is it? But I'll give you a book that has been very influential in my life, and one which has just really struck with me in a more literary sense, I guess. The one that's been very influential in my life was The Lorax by Dr. Seuss.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know whether people have mentioned that one before.
Never. You've got first.
In terms of setting a bit of a sense from a very young age of the impact that people are having on the environment and the responsibility that we all have to take to do something about it. And it's not, the Lorax does not say somebody should do something. It says you should do something. And it's up to you to do something about the challenges that we've got in the world. That's been influential throughout my life from a very, very young age. But I know that sort of, that's not a very highbrow answer.
Oh, no. I think some of the things that stay with us and the wisdom stay with us is out of their simplicity.
The other one I want to mention, it's not about wisdom. It's just about a book that really struck with me, is The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Really?
Which is it really surprised me, because I was reading it because I just decided that there were classics that I hadn't read that I really ought to read, that since there are things you should have done. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a really interesting book. Loads of it's about architecture rather than anything else. There's these long screeds about Paris and Gothic architecture, and it's a sort of love story to Paris and Gothic architecture. But also it's the story, obviously, of Quasimodo, the hunchback, who's in love with Esmeralda, and they both die. And this is, I've never been one for saying you ought to have happy endings. I'm dark at heart in so many ways. But this is a book where that ending is telegraphed from page 1. You know what's going to happen. And all the way through the book, even as somebody who's an old cynic like me, you are seeing this coming. It's inevitable. It's inexorable. And yet, at every step of the way, even somebody like me is going, don't do it. Please don't do it. Please. Surely there's got to be a way through this that makes it a happy ending. And it just isn't. And I think it's an extraordinary book.
And a song.
I've got a very wide musical taste. Everything from opera to heavy metal and everything in between. So I've thought long and hard about this and how obscure should I try and go to say something. But I'm not going obscure. It's a beautiful day out there today. Yeah. And so I'm going to go for Nina Simone's Feeling Good. And again, there are several reasons for that. It's an old song, but she covered it in the 60s at the height of the civil rights movement. And it was a real song of power and emancipation and liberation, which is really resonant. But also, I'm just an optimist. I can't help it. I see the bright side of most things. I look to the future and I think things will always get better. I feel good.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that to us today, Colin, because those resonant tones of Nina Simone, she has such an individualistic and distinctive voice, and feel good because it's a beautiful day. So let me thank you greatly. I'm so delighted that your office got in touch to say you want to come onto the podcast. And it's casting out now to 76 countries, which I'm really proud of. We had a listen yesterday to Frankie McMillan, 10-year-old Frankie, who was listened to in Uruguay. And the world is a much smaller place with the connectivity of podcasts. But you've been a wonderful guest, and you've and given a real degree of credibility to what this podcast stands for. And some interesting insights too. You've got a very serious job, a very important job. But I like the hint of mischief and a bit of rascal and a bit of the darkness that prevails on some of your, when I say darkness, we don't want life just always wrapped up in chocolate box endings, do we? And I don't think your job allows you to get many chocolate box endings with cute little kittens on the front.
Sadly not. But if you don't have a sense of optimism for the future, I just think it's difficult to see where you go in a job. You've got to care, and you've got to think that there's a better future, and that's what motivates me to do things.
On that I will say amen and thank you. This podcast was brought to you by Axiom Joint Venture, the proud sponsors of Assa Marra.